Thank you very much. Can I get the presentation up? Well, thank you first of all for inviting me here to speak about the Academic Freedom Index, which is a project I have been involved with since the very beginning, about 7-8 years ago. The Academic Freedom Index is a global measurement of academic freedom levels that was first published in 2020 and that has appeared every year since. The latest update came out last month, actually. So today I will talk about the data, what it measures, how it measures it, and also what we have found out over the past few years since it first came out. Before I get started, just so I know my audience, I would like to ask you who of you has heard of or even used the Academic Freedom Index before? Oh, nice. Okay. Great. Good. So I think, yes, excellent. I always like to start by pointing out that states have almost universally accepted to respect the freedom indispensable for scientific research, which is part of the International Covenant for Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. But of course, we know that the reality on the ground looks very different. And so 7-8 years ago, this was the context of the CEU being forced out of Hungary. In Turkey, there had just been the failed coup and arrests of mass amounts of academics. And so me and my colleagues, we realized at the time that unlike for various human rights and also different aspects of democracy, there's really nothing available that helps us understand academic freedom at a global scale. And so we asked ourselves, how can we possibly measure it? So we considered many different potential data sources and data types. I won't go into all of this detail now, but suffice to say that for a truly global comparative measurement, we determined that the best approach would be the methodology that is also used in most democracy measurements today, that is to use expert assessments. So this is how we came to create the Academic Freedom Index, and we ended up doing that in partnership with VDEM, the Varieties of Democracy Institute, which is a very well-established social science data set on different aspects of democracy that uses such expert-coded data and aggregates them using statistical models that rely on Bayesian statistics. So in terms of what the index measures, it is composed of the following 5 indicators. We have the freedom to research and teach, the freedom of academic exchange and dissemination, the institutional autonomy of higher education institutions, then something we call campus integrity, that is the absence of security infringements, for example, by police on campus, both online and offline, and also the freedom of academic and cultural expression. So you can see that these different dimensions have already come up a few times over the course of today's discussions, and I think reflect relatively well different components of academic freedom we've been talking about. So in the data set, if you access it yourself, these indicators are available as separate indicators that you can look at individually, but they're also aggregated to an index, which I will explain in a minute. So this is one way of looking at the data. So here you see the global average between countries around the world over a certain period of time, for each indicator separately. So you can see that even though the Academic Freedom Index was first released in 2020, as I mentioned, the data actually stretches far back in time, all the way to 1900 for some countries. And that is because the Academic Freedom Index, like the entire VDEM data set, is a time series data set. So they consult experts not only about the present of academic freedom in certain countries, but also about the history and past years in those countries. I will come back to the questions of these global trends in a minute. But first, I want to talk about how these measurements really come about. What is behind these numbers? So if we look at the data for individual countries, this is what it looks like in a table form. I know it's very small, but it's not so important that you see all the individual numbers. But essentially for each country, here in this example, Turkey, we have data for Turkey 2020, Turkey 2019, Turkey 2018. This is what we call the country year. So for each country year unit, we have a score for each of the indicators and then for the aggregate index. I already mentioned that the methodology relies on expert assessments. So each country year is assessed by experts who get asked a qualitative question. So in this case, the example of freedom to research and teach, the question would be, to what extent are scholars free to develop and pursue their own research and teaching agendas without interference? And alongside this question, they receive a clarification text, some definitions, since we get asked this a lot about whether the Academic Freedom Index only measures state interference, I just want to provide this clarification up front. This is not the case. We are asking explicitly about any kind of interference by non-academic actors, which can, for example, include university administrations, also public pressure, private interests, religious organizations, etc. But of course, and probably empirically most prominent, the interference by states. Anyway, so the experts also receive a response scale. So on this indicator, it goes from 0, completely restricted, to 4, fully free, and each level has a short description. So I won't bore you with all the methodological details, which are quite complicated if you kind of go really into it. If you're interested in all of this, you can read up about it in various papers that have been published both by VDEM about kind of the general methodology and also by the Academic Freedom Index team. We have published, I think, 3 academic papers by now that explain different aspects of the data. But there are a couple of things that are very important to understand in how these expert ratings are used to create the index. The first one of that is that it's not just one expert per country who codes the data, but there were altogether almost 2,400 experts around the world who have so far contributed to the Academic Freedom Index. And this is always a mix of experts within and outside the country. They are diverse in terms of gender and professional experience, although the majority of them are academics. And on average, if we look at the index, the assessments by more than 10 different experts are the basis for each individual data point of the index. The second point that is crucial to understand is that the resulting country scores are not just the mean value between these different experts. Instead, VDEM uses a quite sophisticated statistical model that is based on Bayesian item response theory that aggregates the individual scores into indicators and then the indicators into an index. And the reason why using such a statistical model is important is that we know that experts can be biased, that sometimes they indicate a lower confidence level on some of their ratings. And we also know that different humans simply approach scales differently. And so you need to try to account for all of that when you bring individual assessments together. And this is what the model is set up to do. Okay, so all in all, this is how we end up with these scores for Turkey. So the index itself is scaled from 0, very low, to 1, very high. And if you look at the timeline in the column on the very right, you can see that from the early 2000s, Turkey was somewhere in the middle of the index with moderate restrictions on academic freedom before it then deteriorated severely to hit the bottom of the scale after the failed coup in 2016. I think tomorrow actually we have 2 presentations about Turkey, so we'll hear more about that. If we put these numbers into a graph, this would look like this, but here I've added an extra feature. There's a colored area around the line, which shows the level of uncertainty that is attached to the individual scores. And this is a piece of information that really distinguishes VDEM from, as a scientific endeavor, from many other measurement efforts that use expert data that you might be familiar with. VDEM is very clear about the fact that the resulting scores are statistical estimates. We always need to remember that we're trying to assess a very abstract concept, academic freedom, that we cannot directly observe by just going out into the world and seeing academic freedom is high here. So that means that the whole exercise tries to get as close as possible to what the real level of academic freedom in a country might be. And this necessarily comes with some uncertainty because expert assessments can, of course, never be perfect or give us a very clear image. Okay, so much about the methodology. Let's look at some of the data from our newest update. So here is the most recent data covering 2024 for 179 countries around the world. You can already see that there is a great diversity in the levels of academic freedom between countries and also within the different world regions. Another thing you can tell from here is that the US no longer holds a top score on the index. And of course, what is on our mind these days are the recent developments under the second Trump administration. But the data, which here depicts 2024, also reminds us that academic freedom has actually come under significant pressure in a range of US states already before this latest election. And I'm sure we will hear more about that in a minute. Now, if we look at the global trends over the past 5 decades, we can first of all see that the third wave of democratization led to a global uptick in academic freedom in the early 1990s. But also over the past decade, we see that things seem to have been deteriorating on average. And this emerges even more clearly if we weigh the country scores by population size. Because the most populated countries in the world, namely India, China, the United States, are all among the countries where academic freedom has been declining quite significantly over the past few years. And so we see a very clear downward trend. So I've mentioned the US a couple of times now. The data also provides evidence that the case of the US is really part of a larger trend in terms of the origins of the attacks on academic freedom. So here I want to take up a theme that my colleagues discussed in the report that accompanied the newest data update last month. So for this, they used a different VDEM data set on political parties to show the correlation between academic freedom levels and the influence of anti-pluralist parties in government. So these anti-pluralist parties are defined as lacking commitment first to the democratic process as a legal means of gaining and losing power, to the legitimacy of political opponents, to the peaceful resolution of disagreement, and to minority and civil rights. So the relationship between these two aspects is of course not a deterministic one. But this chart, which depicts country years over a 50-year period for democratic countries or somewhat democratic countries, it does suggest that countries with anti-pluralist parties in power, so these would be the ones towards the top of the chart, tend to have lower levels of academic freedom than those where anti-pluralist parties have little to no political influence, so that's towards the bottom of the chart. So this quantitative indication really connects well with what we know about different country contexts, not only about the United States, but we can also think of cases like Hungary or Argentina recently, but also Poland or Brazil before their latest elections. Okay, to close, I just want to summarize a few points about the Academic Freedom Index measurement. I think that what makes this a really strong data set is the high quality standards of the data collection protocol, which was developed and peer reviewed within the scientific community. In addition, VDEM provides extensive transparency about all of its data, which are publicly accessible, including the coder level data. And our goal with this project was really to create a globally comparative data set that also offers some insights about developments over time. And I think that is what we achieved. The index can very well capture rough differences between countries and also the trends over time. However, there are some caveats with the data that I by no means want to hide. They are country-level data, so they cannot offer us any insights about subnational variation, for example, between different US states, or break it down by discipline, because that's not what we set out to do. Also, when it comes to smaller, more fine-grained, or even very long-term developments, these are just by definition very hard to capture with this kind of data. So for these questions, I really recommend complementing the index data with qualitative case studies or with other very useful data sources that we will still hear about in this roundtable. And finally, I want to stress the point that users of the data should always keep an eye on the uncertainty intervals of the individual data points. I know that from my own experience that this can be quite cumbersome and maybe also take away some of the appeal of a quantitative measure like this. But it's really an essential part of the information provided by the data set. And yeah, we also always encourage discussions and even controversy about the data and findings of the data set. Because to my mind, facilitating and also inspiring such conversations about academic freedom levels and trends is really one of the main benefits that the Academic Freedom Index can offer. So to close, I just want to guide you to some resources, all of which you can find on the Academic Freedom Index website, including on the very left, the latest report that accompanied the data update, as well as on the bottom here, an academic paper that is hot off the press in Perspectives on Politics, where a colleague and I provide a very thorough assessment of the different strengths and weaknesses of the data set. Yeah, with this, I'm at the end looking forward to discussion. Thank you.